So let's do the gig methods, but before we start, I need to make a little change. Now the first method I named getGig_by_event, but it's actually a little confusing, and in fact I got confused myself because I passed in the event ID thinking that it will be for the event that we want the gig for. However, that's not what I really meant. All this method is supposed to do is to return a gig, including the event the gig is in. But in our gig class, you can see that we already have event. So it's kind of unnecessary to call it gig_by_event because the event comes with it. In fact, like I said, it's just confusing. So I'm going to rename this to getGig. And instead of event ID, I'll pass in the gig ID. And of course, since we made the change here, we have to go to our interface and rename the method here as well. So it's just gonna be getGig, and I'll change event ID to gig ID. So we'll simply get a gig based on the ID passed in, and we will either include the comedians or not, and the event comes with it because that's in the class as well. Alright, so let's start creating the method. And the first thing, let's start with the logger again. So we'll go to our logger dot log information, and we can simply say that we are getting a gig for an ID. And now let's create a queryable of type gig, and of course I'll name it query, and we'll go to our event context and go to our gigs dataset, and from here we will select all the gigs. But of course we don't want all the gigs, we only want the one that matches the gig ID. But before we filter it down, we need to check if we want to include the comedians as well. So we'll do an if statement and do include comedians, and if that's true, then we can simply add to our query that we also want to include the comedians. So we'll do query.include, and we'll include C goes into C.comedian. And whether we include the comedians or not, we at the end have to filter it down to a single gig for the gig ID. So we'll do query, and we'll set it to where clause, where the G goes into G.gig ID that matches the gig ID parameter from the method. And like I said, we can also include the event, so I'll simply do here to also include E goes into E.event. And at the end, we'll simply return the first that we find. So we will return and use, of course, async, so we'll do await, and we'll return query with the first or default that we find. Of course, let's make the task async as well. So this is our getGig with the comedians as well as the event. So next, let's do getGigs_by_event, and this is of course going to return all the gigs, a collection of gigs for a specific event. So let me just grab the logger here, and I paste it here, and we are getting gigs for event with the ID event ID. And just like before, first we'll create a query and grab all the gigs. Then we check if we want to include comedians, so I'll copy paste that as well. And at the end, we'll filter it down to a specific event. So we'll do a query, and we'll use a where clause, of course, and we'll filter it down to an event. So our E goes into E.event, where the event ID matches the event ID parameter from the method. And at the end, we can also do order by, and we can order it by the, for example, gig headline. So we'll do order by, and let's do descending this time. So we will order them alphabetically, but in descending order, and we'll do G goes into G.gig gig headline. And of course, at the end, we'll simply return a wait and return the query. But since this is a collection, we'll change it to array async. And let's not forget to make the task async as well. And finally, we'll get the gig by venue. So I'll copy the whole thing here, paste it right here. And the logger can simply say that we are getting gigs by venue ID of venue ID parameter. And just like before, we grab the gigs, we'll grab the comedians, and now we'll get the query but filter it down to a venue ID. So the where clause, I'll delete this, will be v for venue, goes into v.event, and event also has the venue, so we'll go to .venue and we'll match the venue ID with the venue ID parameter. And again, if these match, that is our selection. And we can leave it ordered by gig headline descending, that's okay. And at the end, of course, we return the query as an array async, so let's make the task async as well. Alright, so this is our repository. However, there's few things I wanna change here. Now, the way we set up the gigs would actually work just fine. For example, here for getting gigs by venue, the user asks for gigs and we return gigs. And the user asks for comedians and we include comedians. But we never include the venue. Now this is a matter of preference of how you want to set up your API. Now the venue ID is being passed in, so the venue is actually known. Otherwise we wouldn't have the ID for it. But I still want to return the venue with it. Even though the user doesn't specifically ask for the venue, I want to return it. So here, when we return the query, I'm going to also include, and here we will actually include the venue. So v goes into v.event.venue. And the same for the get gigs by event. We know the event because we are passing the event ID, but I still want to return it. We filter down the gigs only for this event and we return the gigs with comedians, but I'm going to also include the event itself. So we'll go to e goes into e.event. And here, when we ask for the gig, I think that's okay to just include the gig and the comedian. We have the gig ID, so chances are we also have the event available, but not every gig has to be part of an event yet. Maybe there's a gig that is new and is not set up for the event yet. So here we only return the gig and we'll include the comedians. So now let's have a look at the other tasks for the events, for example. So here in the events by date, we include the gigs and we also including the venue as well. And if the gigs are included, then we also include the comedian for each. So this is done well, I think. So here we actually return pretty much everything related to the event. And the same goes for the get events as well as the get event by ID. So with this, our event repository is finished and we are ready to start using it in the controller and start working on our API calls.